Will you pray with me, please? Holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Several years ago, a lovely family from one of our congregations invited our family to a 4th of July party at their country club. Now, we had some hesitation about going because this was a fancy country club in Bethesda, and we didn't know the family that well, but it was such a generous invitation, and the folks were so nice, we decided to go for it. So we dressed our kids in the cutest outfits that they would tolerate. We gave them some stern reminders about manners and appropriate behavior, and for the most part, the evening went well. Our kids behaved. None of us said or did anything incredibly embarrassing. There were games, there was delicious food, there was Independence Day swag. And as we sat there with our host in the middle of this large group of tables set up on the golf course, we were relaxed and happy. We started thinking that maybe we had been overly concerned about the social stakes of the evening. We could navigate a fancy place with small children, no sweat. And then, just as the fireworks started, Nolan, who was sitting in my lap at the time, started to throw up a lot. Now, it was dark, it was really loud because there was fireworks going off. We were literally surrounded by other people at chairs and tables, all of which made for the world's most awkward exit as we tried to thank our host, explain the situation, and get out of there without putting anyone in the splash zone of Nolan's own fireworks display. So much for flawlessly navigating the high-class social scene. Now, Nolan gave me permission to share this story, but despite our best efforts, it is clear that sometimes things just go awry in social situations. And I think truly that can be a real fear in getting to know our neighbors. What if we invite them over for dinner at our house or we host a block party and we discover that we have nothing to talk about? What if we're standing at the fence trying to make conversation and we make a joke about politics only to learn that they feel very differently than we do? What if we labor over the world's most beautiful cake to take next door only to discover that this family has an allergy to gluten? What if we have people over for drinks and realize that our children had left dirty laundry in the bathroom? What if we have a party and somebody causes a scene when all we're doing is trying to make a good impression? Now, Jesus was no stranger to these kinds of social situations. In fact, Jesus sometimes created some of these awkward social situations. But in this case, it's Mary of Bethany who's the one that causes this stir at the dinner party, as Jody was sharing. Now, there's a version of this particular story that appears in all 4 of the Gospels, but John's is the only one where the woman who anoints Jesus is named. And she is very specifically named as Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. Now, you may remember that Mary and Martha had already had this whole little tiff about preparing for and spending time with Jesus that appears in Luke's gospel. Lazarus had been raised from the dead by Jesus just a chapter before in John. And so it is clear that this family spent a lot of time with Jesus. They were good friends with him. But still, in this kind of social situation where they are hosting a dinner party, there were rules to be followed. There were expectations to be met. And Mary, bursting in with burial oil, pouring it on Jesus' feet and using her hair as a towel, was probably not on the evening's agenda. Now, people may have been used to Jesus creating a stir, but I'm sure that the disciples and the other guests were a little taken aback by Mary's forwardness. Judas also hones in on the apparent wastefulness of using expensive funeral oil to anoint a living person when it could have been sold and given to the poor. Now, John gives us this little aside to make sure we know that Judas was really just trying to draw attention away from the fact that he himself was a thief. And so Judas was trying to make himself look better by calling out somebody else, which was honestly the last thing this party needed. Between Mary's raw vulnerability and Judas's false indignation and all this talk about death and poverty, this was kind of becoming a dinner party disaster. One of the hosts was literally someone who had just been in the grave. The guest of honor was someone who was being actively watched by authorities so that they could arrest him. There's a lot of drama happening here. But that's why Jesus' remarks to Judas kind of cut through all of these layers of social tension. Jesus flat out tells Judas to leave Mary alone. And Jesus makes it clear that her extravagant gesture is a welcome gift. And he refuses to take the bait about this false dichotomy of loving him or loving the poor. Jesus also seems to acknowledge that his death is imminent. And so Mary did exactly the right thing by pouring herself out while she still had him in front of her. Jesus didn't apologize for Mary's behavior. He didn't make excuses for the nature of her gift. He didn't need to. Her offering was given in love, freely, selflessly, without reservation. It was this moment of raw human emotion, pure love and devotion poured out. And it was messy, and it was beautiful, and it was true. And while that kind of thing does not always play well at a dinner party, that is precisely the kind of life that Jesus lived. Messy and beautiful and true. And that is precisely the kind of relationship that Jesus invites us into with each other. See, Judas isn't the only one of us who tends to take a transactional view of things. It's tempting for all of us to believe that we are either moving up or falling down the social ladder. It is also easy to be lulled into thinking that gifts or relationship or even people themselves only have value if they produce something. But Mary's gift, just like any other authentic and real human experience, it wasn't one that could be measured in financial worth or social status. There were no returns on her investment, and if anything, it cost her something in social standing. It was a gift offered simply as a gift, like playing a beautiful piece of music, creating a delicious meal, offering an act of kindness to a stranger that you will never see again. The value was in the giving, in the pouring out, which is why it didn't matter if it was done perfectly or followed all the social etiquette rules. So maybe Mary's worship of Jesus in this moment at one of the strangest dinner parties on record can help us to trust that we have nothing to worry about, even in the most mortifying of social situations. Because love and vulnerability is an act of worship. It takes us directly to the feet of Christ. And that kind of open-hearted living, with all the awkwardness and the emotion that comes with it, if that is good enough for loving God, I am confident that it is good enough for loving our neighbors. In fact, it is probably how we love our neighbors best. Not by our immaculate lawns or fabulous parties or witty conversational skills, not because of anything we bring to the table that might make us feel worthy to be there, but because of our open hearts, broken and poured out in this practice of neighboring, of growing and loving and listening and being transformed. Now, it's worth acknowledging that Jesus' line about the poor and how they will always be with us has sometimes been misconstrued as an argument against caring for the poor. And that is clearly only interpreted that way by people who pay no attention to anything else that Jesus said, and are simply looking to justify their selfish behavior. What's more likely is that Jesus was riffing on a verse from Deuteronomy, which says that since there will never cease to be the poor in need on the earth, therefore I command you to open your hand to the poor and the needy among you. I raised this, though, because Judas was actually kind of clever using this kind of argument, trying to leverage compassion against selflessness. And it's important to recognize that it's possible to turn almost anything into a weapon or a commodity. Just ask anybody who's ever had a Bible verse used to tear them down, or had a friendship abused or taken advantage of. Human relationship can be hard. We are complicated, and we are inevitably going to make mistakes, hurt each other, and be caught up in situations that are deeply painful or that test our patience at best. And sometimes it might seem like the only way to survive is by not getting too attached to anybody else and making ourselves feel better than everyone else by doing whatever it takes. That's why, though, Mary's gift and Jesus' response is such a guiding star for us in this art of neighboring, because it is an example of love freely given, not hoarded or wielded or sold. And while there is absolutely no guarantee that living this way will help us to win friends or influence people, it does mean that we have nothing to fear. Because Jesus has shown us that even death itself is no match for a life of selfless love poured out. In the movie Babette's Feast, a gifted Parisian chef named Babette is forced to flee her home because of political upheaval, and she winds up in a small Danish village where she's taken in as a scullery maid and a cook by two sisters, who also happen to be the head of a small and dwindling religious community that was founded by their father. Babette ends up serving as the sisters' cook for the next 14 years, creating very simple, bland meals as they were accustomed to. She works for free because the sisters cannot afford to pay her, and the congregation that they are a part of continues to decline over these years because of infighting and division. One day, however, Babette learns that she has won the lottery in Paris, and she offers to use part of her winnings to cook a feast for the sisters and their small religious community. After some coaxing, they agree to the meal as a kind of parting gift, since Babette will clearly use part of this money to return to Paris and begin her life again. And Babette creates this extraordinary meal for this community, far richer and more elaborate than any of them have ever had before. They don't even fully understand everything that they are eating, much less how much effort it has taken to create that kind of meal. But in the midst of sharing this feast together, arguments are abandoned, grudges are forgiven, and their community starts to be rebuilt and reborn. The night ends with the diners dancing and singing a hymn of praise to God out under the stars. And it is only then that the sisters learn that Babette has actually spent all of her winnings on this meal, that she would not be leaving their village to return to Paris after all, because she had given everything for the sake of this one extraordinary feast. Now, interestingly, I learned that back in 2019, the director, Alexander Payne, was set to direct a remake of Babette's Feast set in, you guessed it, Minnesota. Now, it seems like the pandemic may have derailed those plans, but we can always hold out hope. And whether that Minnesota version ever actually materializes or not, we can still practice that generous love that's shown in Babette's story. That kind that is echoing the love poured out at the table of Mary and Martha and Lazarus and at the feet of Jesus. For Maundy Thursday this year, we are sharing an online worship service and a Zoom gathering option for that night, but there will be no worship experience here in person at the church. We have kept our worship for that night as a virtual option for the purpose of giving you time and space to share a meal with a neighbor. Now, maybe that isn't possible for you quite yet because of COVID precautions. And let me be clear that we are not asking you to compromise your health and your safety. And if you can't swing it to have a meal with one of your neighbors on Thursday, April 14th, but you can get something else on the calendar for another time, that's fine. Do that. What we are asking is that you consider celebrating Maundy Thursday, this remembrance of a meal where Jesus spoke very clearly about pouring himself out in love as a chance to offer yourself in loving relationship with a neighbor, to meet a new neighbor, to deepen an existing relationship, maybe offer hospitality to a neighbor that you know could use it. Don't get too hung up on creating the perfect dinner party. Don't try your best to make sure that nothing awkward happens, because it does. You don't have to talk about Maundy Thursday. You don't even have to share why it is that you've chosen that night to have a meal together. Just create space for vulnerability and for authentic relationship. Love God by loving your neighbors, your actual neighbors. And trust that Christ's presence, broken and poured out, will be right there with you in the room. Amen.